Western Studies. So in the past, we've had Dr. Zunes as a kind of a go-to person on foreign policy matters, mostly related to the Middle East, but he's joined many people who were concerned with the dynamics of the war in Ukraine, and that includes the variety of options that concerned folks like us might take in terms of positions and action. The talk is entitled Russia's Imperialism and Ours, How Should Peace Activists Respond? As that would suggest, there are comparisons to be made among major players on the world stage in different world events, including in the Middle East. And so again, we're pleased to have his thoughts about that. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Stephen Zunes.
Thank you. It's good to be with you all again, albeit remotely. I just want to start off by observing that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a clear-cut act of aggression. It is a flagrant violation of the United Nations Charter and other fundamental principles of international law. It's also, of course, resulted in an enormous level of human suffering, including widespread attacks on civilian population centers. But unfortunately, the history of U.S. militarism, imperialism, and false narratives have led some on the anti-war left to rationalize for Russian aggression and exaggerate Western responsibility. At the same time, there are reasonable criticisms of U.S. policy regarding Ukraine and Eastern Europe, both currently and in the past. Indeed, there are a number of problematic narratives and policies by the Biden administration that have generally been ignored in mainstream discourse. I will be addressing these, but I'd like to start by critically examining some of the narratives on Ukraine by some segments of the anti-war left that I find problematic. And for example, just before the launch of the war in February of last year, there were a number of forums and rallies around the United States calling for no war on Ukraine, which focused on the non-existent threat of direct U.S. military intervention while ignoring the very real and growing threat of a Russian invasion. Such skepticism, of course, proved wrong, but there is a reason for it. I mean, when asked for evidence of an imminent Russian invasion, the Biden administration said just to trust them. But, you know, too many people remember how 20 years earlier, then Senator Biden insisted he had evidence that he couldn't share, that Iraq had somehow miraculously reconstituted their nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons programs. They were stockpiling a huge arsenal of chemical and biological weapons, had SS-20 and SS-22 missiles and other sophisticated delivery systems, and constituted a major threat to U.S. national security. And I should mention that we told Biden, who was then chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and Antony Blinken, who was the committee's Democratic staff director, that these claims were unfounded, yet they refused to allow a single person who questioned these claims to testify before the committee. Instead, bringing in witness after witness who repeated these lies about Iraq's so-called weapons of mass destruction. We even warned them, and others who were calling for an invasion of Iraq at that time, that their falsehoods would soon become obvious and it would seriously damage their credibility and that of the U.S. government, to the point that if the United States or other countries ever were faced with a real threat, many people would refuse to believe them. This is exactly what happened. Subsequently, some of the war crimes committed by Russian forces have been dismissed by some on the anti-war left, again, because of the earlier false and exaggerated U.S. claims regarding atrocities by governments opposed to the United States, such as the Nicaraguan Sandinistas back in the 80s. Similarly, the rationalizations and cover-ups by successive administrations for war crimes committed by Israel and Saudi Arabia and other allies, as well as by U.S. forces in Iraq, Vietnam, and elsewhere, have raised legitimate questions as to whether the U.S. government really cares about civilian casualties in wars. Russian atrocities in Ukraine, however, are nevertheless real, widespread, well documented, and must be categorically condemned. Now, a major argument within some segments of the anti-war movement I wish to challenge is that the argument that, yes, while the Russian invasion has indeed been illegal and brutal, Moscow somehow felt compelled to act by a series of actions by the United States, and that the war and suffering that's resulted is therefore the United States' fault. Now, speaking as someone who has spent most of his academic career exposing and documenting the ways in which much of the violence and injustice in the world is indeed the fault of the United States, I must insist that this is not the case in regard to Ukraine. I mean, it's certainly true that the decision by the United States to break what appears to have been a promise to the Kremlin by former Secretary of State Baker in 1989 that NATO would not expand eastward contributed to Putin's paranoid nationalism. Incorporating former Warsaw Pact countries and 3 former Soviet republics into the Western Alliance could be seen as unnecessarily provocative, particularly considering invasions of Russia from Western Europe through Ukraine, going back to Napoleon through World War I, World War II, the Allied intervention in 1919. But it should be remembered, though, that this was never a formal agreement, though I think it should have been. I mean, personally, I strongly oppose the eastward expansion of NATO. I mean, frankly, I think NATO should have been abolished following the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact. But the United States did not force NATO membership on Eastern European countries. By overwhelming majorities, the people of these countries wanted to join NATO. And while US imperialism has been the primary international threat to much of the world, it has been Russia, from the Russian Empire through the Soviet Union to the Russian Federation of today, which has been the primary threat to Eastern Europeans. Now, the United States, of course, was happy for them to join. It meant extremely lucrative contracts to American arms manufacturers, as these new member states had to purchase NATO-compatible weapon systems. Rightly or wrongly, however, it was a genuine choice of these small countries, which had recently endured over 40 years of unwelcome domination and intervention by Moscow. So I think it's important that we not engage in what could be called West-splaining, only seeing the decisions by the peoples and governments of Eastern Europe through the lens of an East-West conflict, and failing to recognize they had their own reasons to want to ally with the West. Indeed, to deny agency to Eastern Europeans is in itself indicative of a kind of imperialist mindset. It's the sovereign right of nations to join military alliance with whomever they want, even if we don't agree. For decades, Washington couldn't understand why so many in Latin America embraced Marxism and looked to the Soviet Union for protection from US imperialism. The US falsely assumed that Latin American nations were simply passive victims of Russian aggression and expansionism, and the US was therefore forced to intervene in self-defense. And we shouldn't fall into this trap regarding the United States and Ukraine. For example, Cuba had every right to ally with the Soviet Union during the Cold War because they, like Eastern European nations today, had legitimate fears regarding a powerful neighbor with a history of intervening in their country. The tragic irony, of course, is that the Russian invasion has greatly strengthened NATO. It's really set back anti-war people in Europe and North America. I mean, even leading historically neutral countries like Finland and Sweden to want to join. And it's been used as an excuse for increasing already bloated military budgets here in the West at the expense of human needs. It split the Western left and peace movements while strengthening the militarists. Russia's invasion is also a flagrant violation of the 1994 Budapest Agreement, in which Ukraine agreed to destroy its nuclear weapons inherited from the Soviet Union in return for guarantees of territorial integrity. As with the US invasion of Iraq after that country had eliminated its nuclear program as required, Russia's invasion has been a major setback to non-proliferation efforts, sending the message that countries can't rely on disarmament treaties and need to develop a nuclear deterrent. I mean, given Russian history, their insecurity about NATO's growth is indeed understandable. But I would argue NATO is not an actual threat. There is no evidence of aggressive intentions against Russia. Military spending by these Eastern European countries actually declined when they became members of NATO relative to when they were members of the Warsaw Pact. Similarly, the United States was not pushing for NATO to join the alliance either, for the very reason that Russians could indeed see it as provocative. Now, the US refused to rule it out, as I believe they should have, but they made clear it would not be happening in the foreseeable future. I mean, some argue that the crisis might have been avoided if NATO had been willing to explicitly rule out membership for Ukraine, granting the nation a guaranteed neutral status similar to Finland and Austria during the Cold War. I wish they had, but at the same time, if you read Putin's statements attempting to justify the invasion, he barely mentions NATO. Instead, as we've seen from his rewriting of history, insisting that Ukraine does not have a right to exist and that it's inherently part of Russia, rejecting Lenin's call for self-determination in favor of the czarist notion of a greater Russia. I mean, the fact that he decided to launch a full-scale invasion and his failure to offer a withdrawal from Ukrainian territory in return for a promise of neutrality is indicative that he would have probably invaded Ukraine regardless. Early in the war, I mean, he could have entered negotiations and probably won an agreement that Ukraine wouldn't join NATO or allow foreign troops within its country, as well as an agreement for limited autonomy of the predominantly Russian-speaking areas. He could have declared victory and withdrew. Instead, he has doubled down by illegally annexing occupied territory, expanding conscription, and attacking Ukraine's civilian infrastructure. Why did Putin decide to invade then? Here's my theory. As an analogy, let me reference Noam Chomsky's analysis of U.S. interventions in Latin America against left-leaning governments. Chomsky has correctly noted that none of these socialist governments or revolutionary movements were a threat to the United States, nor in many cases did they threaten any U.S. economic interest. There was very little investments or coveted natural resources in Nicaragua, for example. It's like the poorest country in the hemisphere, just about. Yet back in the 1980s, Washington was nevertheless willing to raise a mercenary army, mine the harbors, sabotage their economy, and threaten a full-scale invasion. The threat, Chomsky argues, was the emergence of a successful alternative to the foreign investment-driven neoliberal economic model Washington was trying to impose on Latin America. If these socialist experiments were seen to be doing a better job at meeting the needs of their people, other countries where the United States might indeed have extensive economic interest, or certainly collectively, they might try to emulate them. It's what Chomsky has referred to as the threat of a good example. Now, since its independence in 1991, Ukraine had been ruled by either corrupt pro-Russian blocs or corrupt pro-Western blocs. The 2019 landslide election victory by Volodymyr Zelensky, an outsider, unaffiliated with either side, represented a break with the old order. He defeated the incumbent pro-Western oligarch, Petro Poroshenko, with 73% of the vote. Now, during his first three years in office, Zelensky made only marginal progress in cleaning things up, and his neoliberal economic policies alienated many on the left in Ukraine, but he did give hope that Ukraine was moving in a direction of a liberal democratic European state with EU membership on the horizon. I would argue that an increasingly well-functioning and prosperous democracy in a country with a similar culture and history as Russia would, to the Kremlin, amount to a threat of a good example. I mean, under Putin, Russia seems to have combined some of the worst elements of the czarist and communist systems. And while I was never a big fan of the Soviet version of socialism, I did recognize that during the Cold War, that the Kremlin was mostly on the right side of national liberation struggles. On balance, they supported progressive alternatives to US imperialism. Today, however, Russia is a reactionary force, allying with right-wing authoritarian-minded leaders like Orban, Le Pen, Trump, and others. And those of us in the anti-imperialist left must recognize that unlike in previous decades when the major challengers to US hegemony were on the left, today it's just the opposite. Putin's Russia, Salafist extremists like the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS, the Iranian mullahs, the Sudanese junta, the Burmese generals, among others. I mean, these are coming from the right. Now, this does not mean we should oppose US imperialism and militarism any less, or that we shouldn't point out how US foreign policy has in some cases actually encouraged the rise of such forces. But we must stop defending or rationalizing such reactionary forces just because they oppose US imperialism. Putin is homophobic, racist, Islamophobic. He's a despot who violently suppresses nonviolent liberal and leftist dissent. I mean, Russia under Putin is in no way socialist. It has one of the highest levels of inequality in the world. Indeed, Putin's right-wing ultranationalism is closer to fascism than it is to communism. Ironically, Putin apologists have tried to claim that the Ukrainian government, headed by Zelensky, who is Jewish, is some kind of neo-Nazi regime. In reality, though, Ukrainian fascists have only received around 2.5% of the vote in the most recent elections and have no representation in the cabinet and parliament or in the top military leadership. I mean, some Ukrainian militia affiliated with the Ukrainian armed forces, such as the Azov battalion, do have fascist roots. Indeed, between 2017 and 2020, the Azov battalion had no more than 2,500 combatants. Now, some Ukrainian officials in recent years have unfortunately honored some far-right figures among the many nationalist heroes from the last century, but this is no indication that fascists play a significant role in the Ukrainian government. Indeed, they don't. But just as U.S. military action in the greater Middle East in the name of protecting Americans from ideological extremism and violence in the area has ended up largely encouraging such ideological extremism and violence, Russia's actions in the name of protecting Russians from far-right Ukrainian ultranationalists has encouraged their growth in the tendency, though again, it remains a small, if well-armed minority. Similarly, claims of some kind of genocide against ethnic Russians by the Ukrainian government and allied militia is unfounded. In the 8 years of fighting against Russian-backed separatists in eastern Ukraine, this was between 2014 and 2022, roughly 3,000 civilians were killed by the shelling, landmines, unexploded ordnance, and other means. Both sides are responsible, and for the deaths. And the numbers have been declining each year prior to the Russian invasion. I mean, it's terrible, but it's not genocide. Indeed, Zelensky himself is an ethnic Russian. Now, there are still a good number of legitimate criticisms of Zelensky's government and his policies. However, just as concerns about human rights abuses or other policies by the Venezuelan or Cuban or Nicaraguan governments can never justify U.S. interventionism in these countries, neither can problematic policies by Zelensky and other Eastern European governments be used to excuse Russians' intervention. I mean, Saddam Hussein's regime, if you recall, was one of the most brutal and repressive in the world. But when the United States was in the process of invading it, the focus, quite correctly, was fighting against the criminal U.S. invasion of the country, not pointing out all the terrible things that the Iraqi government had done. Now, it's indeed tragic that Ukraine is experiencing such a devastating war in light of their impressive history of nonviolent resistance, including the 2004-2005 Orange Revolution, following an effort by the ruling party to install the pro-Russian Viktor Yanukovych as the new president and still an election. The massive civil insurrection forced a new election in which the pro-Western opposition won. Yanukovych won the presidency legitimately in 2010, but rampant corruption, unpopular policies, and increasing political repression led to the 2013-2014 Maidan Revolution, which forced his departure, and after a short interim government made way for a new round of elections a few months later. Now, both these uprisings were overwhelmingly nonviolent. There was rioting and street fighting during the Maidan protests. but they were kind of the equivalent of the black bloc groups that have taken advantage of large nonviolent protests against racism and neoliberal globalization here in the United States, and that they got disproportionate amount of media coverage, but they were not leading the struggle. And the armed fascist groups that seized some government buildings in the final hours of the Maidan uprising were of little consequence as well. Yanukovych had already fled to Russia by that hour. Now, some on the anti-war left have tried to depict the popular uprising against Yanukovych as a US-sponsored coup d'etat, sponsoring then Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland's efforts to influence the makeup of the post-Yanukovych interim government, and an earlier trip to Ukraine, which she expressed her solidarity to the protests by passing out bread to demonstrators. Also, there's no question that the U.S. directly and indirectly provided some funding to some opposition groups. Some people toss the figure of $5 billion around, but that's totally inaccurate. It was
Nuland's comment.
What?
That's Nuland's comment.
No, she was referring to the total amount of U.S. foreign aid to Ukraine since its independence in 1991, including when pro-Western governments were in power that the U.S. presumably did not want to overthrow. Indeed, it's also true that the Soviet Union provided some aid to leftist revolutionaries around the world and tried to influence the makeup of post-revolutionary governments. However, the claim by Reagan and others that the Soviets caused these revolutions or led these revolutions or exported these revolutions, or these revolutions were Soviet coups, denies agency to oppress peoples who rose up against various right-wing US-backed dictatorships. Now, one can certainly make the argument that the Ukrainian opposition should have accepted a compromise proposal to hold early elections instead of insisting on Yanukovych's immediate removal. However, a massacre of protesters by government forces and other acts of repression hastened defections among security forces, led pro-government parliamentarians to join the opposition, prompted an increasing number of government workers to strike. It basically convinced Yanukovych he no longer had control of the government, forcing him to flee to Russia. So the Maidan uprising, like the Orange Revolution, more closely resembled the popular unarmed insurrections that have overthrown autocrats like Marcos in the Philippines, Duvalier in Haiti, Ben Ali in Tunisia, Mubarak in Egypt, Suharto in Indonesia, Milosevic in Serbia, than the very real US-backed coups in such countries as Guatemala, Iran, Brazil, and Chile during the Cold War. Similarly, so, there's this idea that this limited amount of U.S. assistance and interference somehow delegitimizes the 2013-24 popular struggle is just as simplistic as those who insist the Soviets are carrying out a hit list in Central America and elsewhere by supposedly instigating these struggles. Again, it denies agencies to the millions of Ukrainians who, like leftist revolutionaries in an earlier era, made some political mistakes, some miscalculations, and some policies that might not agree with, but they were motivated by a sincere desire for greater freedom, justice, and self-determination. I mean, the burden of proof should belong to those who have thus far failed to provide evidence that the hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians who have twice braved winter cold for months in overwhelmingly nonviolent protests, and the millions of others who honored calls for strikes and boycotts would have failed to do so were it not for the United States. So this raises the question, could this impressive homegrown nonviolent legacy be applied in the face of Russian invasion today? I mean, some people have called on the Ukrainians to engage in massive nonviolent resistance, which would make occupied Ukraine ungovernable, like the kind that freed the Baltic republics from Russian occupation in the early 1990s. In fact, when Mariupol was first occupied by pro-Russian militia in 2004, they were forced to retreat when more than 5,000 steelworkers marched into the city center, forcing them from the government buildings they had captured. After a successful Russian conquest of the city early in the war, the Ukrainian army forces retook the city by force, but much of it's been destroyed in the process. I mean, it's certainly difficult to nonviolently defend cities under heavy aerial bombardment, though there have been some impressive nonviolent protests and large-scale non-cooperation in Ukrainian cities under Russian occupation. A case can be made that a comprehensive nonviolent defense plan based on massive non-cooperation could make the Russian occupation untenable, but it's probably unrealistic to expect Ukrainians to lay down their arms and hope that subsequent Russian occupation of their country could be defeated accordingly. The best hope for a nonviolent resolution would come from within Russia itself, where despite a very repressive political environment, many thousands of individual and collective actions have taken place. The United States and other Western countries therefore need to pursue policies which would encourage the Russian opposition and undermine the nationalist sentiment that the West has sometimes provoked and has strengthened Putin's hand, including offering temporary asylum for any Russians and their immediate families fleeing military conscription. Unfortunately, the Biden administration has not only refused to do so, they've actually been deporting Russian draft resistors seeking to enter the United States, sending them back to Russia, where they faced immediate conscription, jail, or worse. Now, U.S. policy has been focused on sending tens of billions of dollars worth of arms and other military equipment to support the Ukrainian government. On one hand, some could argue that this is one of the rare cases where U.S. military aid is legitimate. Most U.S. armed transfers go to dictatorial regimes and occupation armies. In this case, the United States is actually supporting a democracy rather than a dictatorship, and is arming a country that's being invaded and occupied rather than a country that is an invader and occupied. And legally, the Ukrainians have every right to fight until every inch of their illegally occupied territory has been liberated from Russian occupation, and the United States and other Western countries have the right to provide them the arms to do so. My question, though, is at what price? There are legitimate questions as to whether the ceasefire, as to whether the ceasefire line ends up at the international border, or 50 to 100 miles into Ukraine, as it is in 4 eastern and southern provinces, really worth the enormous amount of deaths, injuries, financial costs, environmental damage, and the risks of escalation, including a nuclear war. Biden and Blinken have repeatedly claimed that extending the war, regardless of the cost, is a matter of principle and upholding the international legal order. The U.S. position is that it is worth enabling the Ukrainians to fight indefinitely, sacrificing tens of thousands of lives, destroying cities and livelihoods, inflicting enormous financial and environmental costs, is necessary to uphold international law. Biden and Blinken correctly note that the Russian invasion is a flagrant violation of the UN Charter that prohibits any country from invading another. But given that both Biden and Blinken supported the 2003 invasion of Iraq, also a war of aggression in violation of the UN Charter, it's not like they actually believe it needs to be upheld. Similarly, their insistence that no country has the right to unilaterally change its borders or to expand its territory by force is also correct. But the Biden administration does not support this principle either. The United States is the only country in the world to have formally recognized Israel's illegal annexation of Syria's Golan Heights and Morocco's illegal annexation of the entire nation of Western Sahara. And Western Sahara, remember, is a full member state of the African Union that's been recognized by more than 80 countries. Both the Golan and Western Sahara were seized by military force. U.S. government maps, unlike most world maps, show both these areas as part of the conquering nation with no delineation between them. And U.S. government reports treat these occupied territories as inherently part of the occupying power. I mean, even under Reagan and the Bushes, who strongly supported Israel and Morocco, the United States refused to recognize these illegal annexations, with the Reagan administration supporting a UN Security Council resolution, 497, you can look it up, declaring Israel's 1981 annexation of the Golan as null and void. It was Trump who formally recognized these two armistice efforts, but Biden, despite reversing some of Trump's other controversial foreign policy decisions, has refused to heed calls to rescind them. The Western Sahara recognition has been particularly controversial, with State Department officials, allied governments, and members of Congress, ranging from liberal Senator Pat Leahy to conservative Republican Senator James Inhofe, opposing it, calling for Biden to rescind this recognition. So Biden's claim that the United States is supporting Ukraine because it always stands up to bullies would be news to the Yemenis, Lebanese, Palestinians, and Sahrawis and others who've been subjected to massive military attacks by U.S. armed allies. Similarly, U.S. criticism of Russia's veto of the United Nations Security Council resolution condemning their invasion rings hollow in light of successive U.S. vetoes of UN Security Council resolutions challenging U.S. invasions of Grenada and Panama, U.S. attacks on Nicaragua, and Israel's invasions of Lebanon. Similarly, the United States has repeatedly insisted that the Palestinians give up large swaths of the Israeli-occupied West Bank seized by Israel, seized by military force, as part of a peace agreement. And previously, the U.S. supported Indonesia's illegal occupation and annexation of East Timor for nearly a quarter century, and since the 1990s, it has unofficially recognized Israel's illegal annexation of occupied Greater East Jerusalem. Now, let's say we have a ceasefire in place, back to Ukraine. If a ceasefire in place, allowing Ukraine to provisionally hold on to the 17% of Ukraine it currently occupies, would set a dangerous new precedent. One can make a stronger case for continuing to arm Ukraine and indefinitely port their struggle to free themselves from Russian occupation. However, since U.S. support for the Israeli and Moroccan occupations demonstrates that the United States doesn't actually care about such a precedent, and U.S. support for the Ukrainian war effort is therefore rooted in geopolitics rather than principle, it's not so clear-cut. I recall how the West reluctantly accepted the Cold War division of Germany, recognizing that while a Soviet-imposed communist system on 28% of Germany was wrong on a number of levels, it was not worth risking a direct confrontation with the Soviet Union. Eventually, given how much better the West German system was doing than the East German system, the communist state collapsed and the country was reunited 40 years later. Some very mainstream international relations scholars like Graham Allison have argued that Ukraine as a rebuilt, prosperous EU member state would have a similar draw to the Russian-occupied portion of Ukraine as West Germany did for the East, and could very well lead to eventual peaceful reunification. And ongoing sanctions and international isolation, combined with growing dissent within Russia itself, would likely lead to reunification in far less than 40 years. There's no guarantee of that, of course, and U.S. hypocrisy and double standards does not mean the United States, shouldn't continue to support Ukraine. I mean, sometimes the United States, like other governments, will do the right thing for the wrong reasons. But there needs to be serious questioning as to what the trade-off is between allowing continued Russian occupation of 17% of Ukraine and an ongoing military stalemate, which has already resulted in hundreds of thousands of casualties. A ceasefire would not be rewarding aggression. If the war ended tomorrow, it would not be seen as a Russian victory, since they came nowhere close to the goal of toppling the Ukrainian government, forcibly annexing the country, and the human and material costs to Russia have been overwhelming. I mean, though I would personally support a ceasefire in place, I'm not convinced it is necessarily where the focus of the peace movement should be. Primarily because this is ultimately Ukrainians' decision, and the vast majority, including most Russian speakers, appear to be willing to fight on. There's no guarantee that an end to U.S. support for Ukraine would lead them to stop fighting the invaders any more than the Vietnamese would have stopped fighting the United States and its puppet regime in Saigon had the Soviets and Chinese suspended aid. The primary reason that the smaller Ukrainian armed forces have successfully defended most of their country from the far larger Russian military is not U.S. aid, but the motivation. Ukrainian soldiers are fighting for their country. Russian soldiers are fighting an imperialist war. And from Vietnam to Afghanistan, we have seen how such a disequilibrium can disadvantage even the most powerful armed forces. Ukraine, like Vietnam, is a former colony threatened by reconquest, and they're not about to give up. I mean, during the Vietnam War, even pacifists didn't call on the Soviets and Chinese to stop arming North Vietnam and the National Liberation Front, since it was clear who the aggressor was. Instead, just again, despite my skepticism about U.S. arming Ukraine and opposition to a ceasefire, I would propose that the peace movement focus its energies on the following. First would be to demand the Biden administration renounce its recognition of the illegal Israeli and Moroccan occupations and its policy of blocking UN Security Council action to resolve these conflicts, and demand that these allies withdraw from all their occupied territories. These are positions the United States should have taken long ago, but the strong stance the Biden administration has been taking in regard to Ukraine has provided an important opening to press these issues. It exposes the hypocrisy and double standards to an unprecedented degree. We should make clear that in raising these issues, this is no excuse for Russian aggression, and our opposition should be no less. This is not whataboutism that seeks to obscure the issue at hand. This is not a yes but a yes and. For the Palestinians and the Western Saharans, oppressed people with few allies in Washington, this offers an unprecedented opportunity to bring attention to their plight and end U.S. support for these illegal and oppressive occupations. Indeed, this would also help the Ukrainian cause. If the Biden administration reversed their recognitions of the illegal Israeli and Moroccan occupations and its support for the occupations, it would make it possible to show that Western opposition to Russian aggression is indeed based on international law, not simply a geopolitical calculation in which the U.S. insists that its allies can engage in illegal activities while Russia cannot. It will deny a key talking point to Putin and his apologists. I've been to Africa twice since the Russian invasion. I've met with everybody from cab drivers to foreign ministry officials. Whenever Ukraine would come up, and whenever I would express, that U.S. is right to condemn the Russian invasion, they always bring up Western Sahara. They always bring up Morocco and Israel and their occupations, the U.S. support for them, every time. This is really hurting U.S. credibility. Similarly, the U.S. cannot seriously raise concern about Russia's lack of democracy, suppression of anti-war opponents, and other human rights abuses as long as the United States continues to provide unconditional arms transfers and other support for dictatorial regimes around the world. Biden has stated that U.S. aid to Ukraine is, quote, about freedom, freedom for Ukraine, freedom everywhere. We must use this opportunity to expose the Biden administration's support for oppressive regime and redouble our efforts to challenge U.S. policy of arming such oppressive dictatorships as Egypt, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and others. The indictment of Putin and other Russian officials by the International Criminal Court also opens an opportunity. While the Biden administration has hailed the indictment, U.S. law prohibits the United States from cooperating with the ICC in any way. If the Biden administration, through satellite imagery, intelligence, and other means, had proof of Russian war crimes, they would be unable to hand them over by law. Indeed, U.S. law bans foreign aid to any country that joins the ICC, albeit with a waiver Biden and other presidents have provided, and it grants the president the authority to use military force to free American or others or citizen of an allied country held by or on behalf of the ICC. This is why it's been nicknamed the Hague Invasion Act. It was passed in 2003. Now, Biden has not only refused to call for that law to be repealed, he has attacked the ICC for its investigation into possible war crimes by U.S. allies. So the Ukraine crisis and the ICC indictment would be an excellent opportunity at Congress and administration to change the law and stop attacking the ICC. And another thing is that we need to challenge the goal stated by Secretary of Defense Austin. The goal of the war is to weaken Russia. The focus should be on defending Ukraine, not defeating the Russian Federation. This is illegal. This is illegitimate. It just strengthens the Russian ultranationalism. And related to this is to stop any further expansion of NATO in return to our Russian withdrawal. Most importantly, the United States must finally get serious about nuclear disarmament, starting with reversing Biden's plans to spend hundreds of billions of dollars to modernize and upgrade the United States nuclear arsenal, already by far the largest in the world. All these things would diminish Putin's efforts to maintain popular support through manipulating nationalist fears among the Russian public. Now, it's not our place to insist the Ukrainians engage in nonviolent resistance, while many Western governments, particularly the United States, pursue policies that makes it difficult for nonviolent resistance in Russia to successfully challenge Putin. As with many other conflicts around the world, the best way to support nonviolence resistance abroad is to engage in it at home. And, with the attention of the world on Russia, and, with sympathy to a people who are being bombed, who are being invaded, who are being oppressed, or being occupied, this is the perfect opportunity to point out the ways the United States is engaging the same kind of policies, and to redouble our efforts in challenging U.S. militarism and imperialism everywhere.